Jean Wilson and Barbara Ann Scott. They didn't just win medals, they shifted culture until ignoring women's achievement was no longer an option. Before Canada quite knew how to celebrate women who were strong and competitive, this is a story about two of those women, and how what begins quietly can, over time, reshape a country's expectations. I'm Stephanie Allen, and this is Dead Canadians Carved in Stone, where we dig into the history and the mystery of lives carved in stone. Today, we're exploring two extraordinary Canadian athletes, and the moment when women's excellence forced sports history to make room for them. Jean Wilson came of age in an era when women were steadily expanding their place in public life, in universities, in profession, and in sport. The early 20th century offered opportunity, but the world wasn't quite ready for women like her. Jean Wilson skated because she loved it, and because she was good, very good. Jean Wilson was born on July 19th, 1910 in Glasgow, Scotland, and she moved with her family to Canada as a child. She began skating at the age of 15 and developed her skill quickly through local clubs in Toronto, discovering a passion that would carry her to national competition. By her late teens, Jean was dominating Canadian women's speed skating. In 1931, she was North American indoor champion and one of the stars of Canadian skating. At the 1932 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, where women's speed skating was included as a demonstration sport, she won the 500-meter event with a time faster than the standing world record. Because of a technicality in the race format, it meant it was not recognized officially as a world record. She also placed second in the 1500-meter, narrowly behind American skater Kit Klein, and she competed in the 1000-meter but fell just a few meters from the end. Women's speed skating in 1932 was not yet an official Olympic event. Official medals were not awarded, but the performances were widely publicized and helped raise the profile of women in sport. She also captured multiple national titles. In a time when women's sport received little attention or it was dismissed as a novelty, Jean's achievements were extraordinary, proving that Canadian women could excel in winter athletics. Her rise was swift. Her career was brief. Soon after her successes and a promising career, Wilson was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, a serious progressive neuromuscular disease that ended her competitive career and her life. She died in Toronto on September 3rd, 1933, at the age of 23. After her death, the Toronto Telegram established the Jean Wilson Trophy for indoor women's speed skating, and she was later inducted into the Speed Skating Hall of Fame. Jean Wilson's achievements came at a time when women's speed skating was still in its infancy, and her success at Lake Placid, particularly her 500-meter win, helped demonstrate that Canadian women could compete on the international stage even before women's sports were officially recognized. Despite her brief life, Jean Wilson left a lasting mark. She helped lay the foundation for Canadian women to compete at the highest levels of winter sport, inspiring a generation that followed, including future Olympic champion Barbara Ann Scott. Today, we are at Mount Hope Cemetery in Toronto in search of the final resting place of Jean Wilson. She was a household name back in the 1930s for winning an Olympic gold medal in speed skating. Let's go find Jean Wilson. We've just had this magnificent snowfall, and it really just feels right to be here in the winter, because it was in the winter on the ice where she made her mark. And this is her final resting place, here in Mount Hope Cemetery in Toronto. Jean Wilson might not be a name you're familiar with, but her fame and the mark that she left on Canadian history unfolded in the winter months here in Toronto. She was a speed skater who shot to fame in the 1930s with a gold medal win in the Olympic Games at Lake Placid. But today, we very seldom hear her name. We don't see her on the highlight reels, but she's part of the reason, part of that foundation that made that possible today. Sometimes history just sits quietly, patiently, enduring, and waiting for us to come back and say, We see you. We know the mark that you left, and we will not forget. Standing there in the snow at Mount Hope Cemetery, it's impossible not to think about how much changed in the years that followed Jean Wilson's death. The Second World War reshaped Canada's understanding of women's capability. Women flew planes, built machines, ran farms, and held communities together. By the time peace returned, Canadians were ready. Canadians were eager for women to excel, not just in everyday life, but in other arenas. And that is when Barbara Ann Scott stepped onto the ice. Barbara Ann Scott arrived at exactly the right moment. Radios crackled in living rooms, newspapers arrived on every doorstep. After years of war and restraint, Canadians were ready for joy. She didn't just skate beautifully, she gave the country permission to feel it collectively. Her wins were our wins. Barbara Ann Scott was born on May 9th, 1928, in Ottawa, Ontario. She began skating at the Minto Skating Club, where she demonstrated her extraordinary dedication from a very early age. By age 11, she had already won the Canadian junior title, and by the age of 13, she was the first woman to land a double Lutz in competition. She continued to dominate women's figure skating throughout the 1940s and was the Canadian national champion for several years before making her mark on the international ice. And in 1947, she won the World Figure Skating Championship, becoming the first North American to claim that title. A year later, she represented Canada at the 1948 Winter Olympics in St. Moritz, Switzerland. The ice conditions weren't good for her event. Hockey and figure skating shared the same outdoor rink, so Scott had to compete on ice that had been rutted by hockey games and softened by the unseasonably warm temperatures. In spite of the conditions, she captured Olympic gold, the first Canadian woman to win an individual Olympic gold medal in figure skating. Her free skate routine was replayed on newsreels internationally. Her victories came at a pivotal historical moment. The 1936 Games had been overshadowed by political tension. The Second World War had halted international sport entirely. When the Olympics resumed in 1948, nations were searching for renewal, and Scott's elegance, grace, composure, and youth made her an emblem for post-war optimism. Scott became a national icon. She was widely called Canada's sweetheart, with intense media coverage, public celebrations, and even collectible dolls. She arrived at a moment when Canada was ready to celebrate women publicly. After the 1948 competitive season, Scott turned professional, skating with touring shows such as the Hollywood Ice Review and other international exhibitions. She remained active in the skating world throughout her life, serving as a judge, carrying the Olympic torch in 1988 in Calgary and 2010 in Vancouver, and remained connected to the sport for the rest of her life. Barbara Ann Scott died on September 30th, 2012, at her home on Amelia Island in Florida, at the age of 84. She's buried with her husband, Tom King, at Bosque Bello Cemetery in Florida. I had an opportunity to interview a very special lady who remembers Barbara Ann Scott's big wins in 1947 and 1948. And we sat down together and shared a cup of tea and shared some stories and some recollections of that time. In 1937, Eleanor Scott was born into a country on the edge of war. By the mid-1940s, her father was serving in the Navy, and the family had relocated to Rawdon, Quebec, a small village about 50 miles north of Montreal.
I was born in 1937. We were living in Montreal, but we had to go to Rawdon because Dad had gone into the Navy, and there was just my brother, Billy, and I, and it was getting a little too expensive for Mom. She was afraid she was going to have to go back home and live with her mother and 6 sisters. Well, Uncle John told Mom, I'll get you a place for $12 a month. Only didn't have a bathtub.
Rawdon was not a large place. What Rawdon had in abundance was winter. Skating in Rawdon was not a special occasion. It was woven into everyday life. In fact, for some children, it was a practicality.
The population then was I don't think it was 2,000. It would go up to about 8,000 or 9,000 in the summer. It was quite nice, and we were very lucky. They had a couple of rinks. One was at the school, and then one of the hotels in the village. We had to skate to school sometimes. We always had a pair of slippers, something at school, because then we could still go out skating on the rink.
By February 1947, one name appeared in the newspapers and crackled over the radio across Canada. Skating was no longer just a pastime in villages like Rawdon. It was national news. I asked Eleanor how she heard this big news.
In the papers and the news, the radios talked about everything, you know, and she got lots of publicity.
And then, about a week later, Eleanor Scott's family had news of their own.
I had a little sister. February the 22nd was my father's birthday. Her name was Barbara Ann Scott. Dad just got home, and he says, "It's my birthday. She's going to be Barbara Ann Scott." And that's how it went.
Her name was a tribute, chosen at a moment when the country was celebrating. When the champion visited Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto a number of years later, there were celebrations and appearances, crowds gathering to see the young woman who had captured international attention. And among those present at Maple Leaf Gardens was a little girl who carried the same name.
She was they had her at the gardens they had something going on, celebrating or whatever. Mm-hmm. And that's when your mother went down and presented her with some flowers.
Oh. And that little girl was my mother. She was 5 years old when she met the woman that she was named after. It's a memory that stayed with her whole life, and with our family. It's a small but vivid way history entered our lives. Barbara Ann Scott's victories came at a pivotal time. In 1948, the world was ready for celebration. For many Canadians, her success felt larger than sport. It symbolized renewal, possibility, a sense that the world was moving forward again. In places like Rawdon, where children skated to school and winter shaped everyday life, that national story felt personal. Ice was ordinary there, but for a brief moment in 1948, it carried the weight of a country's hopes. And Barbara Ann Scott came along at the right time.
She did. And it was good vibes. It made everybody feel better.
That may be the simplest definition of legacy I have ever heard. It made everybody feel better. In Rawdon, an international headline became part of a family history. In Toronto, years earlier, a young woman had pushed open the door, proving that Canadian women could compete at the highest level. One expanded what was possible, the other carried it forward. Today, as we look forward to the 2026 Olympics in Italy, women's sport will be faster, louder, and more visible than Jean Wilson or Barbara Ann Scott could have imagined. But it didn't start there. Jean Wilson's legacy rests quietly in Mount Hope Cemetery. Barbara Ann Scott's legacy lived vividly on radios, in newspapers, in at least one household where her name became part of the family. Between them, we can see how women's excellence moved from proving it was possible to being celebrated as normal. That shift didn't happen all at once, but once it happened, it didn't disappear. National pride doesn't begin in stadiums. It begins on frozen ponds, small villages, cemeteries, and in family stories. Jean Wilson, Barbara Ann Scott. 2 women, 2 eras, and one country learning, slowly, how to see them. I'm Stephanie Allen. This has been Dead Canadians, Carved in Stone.